Hey, welcome back to the show, and a big thank you for tuning in once again.
As always, we've got a glossary waiting for you in the description, so if any word catches you off guard, it's right there.
All right, let's dive in.
Okay, so Jake, I have to ask you something. Do you watch true crime documentaries?
Oh, absolutely. Way too many, if I'm honest. Why?
Because I've been completely hooked on this new Netflix series about a con artist, and I genuinely cannot stop watching it. I finished 4 episodes last night.
4 episodes in one night? That's either impressive or a little alarming. Possibly both.
I know. But that's kind of what I want to talk about today, actually. Why do we do that? Why are so many people, like millions of people across the world, completely obsessed with true crime?
That is such a good question, and it's not a new thing either. People have been fascinated by crime stories for centuries. Think about it. Even classic literature is absolutely full of murders, mysteries, and psychological darkness.
That's a really interesting point. Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie, Edgar Allan Poe, it's always been there in some form.
Exactly. But in the last 10 years or so, true crime has gone absolutely massive as a genre. Podcasts, documentaries, YouTube channels, books, even TikTok videos. There's an enormous market for it, and it just keeps growing.
And the audience is huge and surprisingly diverse. Studies show that women in particular tend to consume more true crime content than men, which is kind of ironic because women are also statistically more likely to be victims of violent crime.
Right. And that actually leads into one of the most interesting psychological theories about why people are drawn to it. It's sometimes called the safety theory.
Oh, I've read about this. Can you explain it for our listeners?
Sure. The idea is that by watching or listening to crime stories, people, especially women, are actually learning survival strategies without realizing it. You're watching what the victim did, what mistakes were made, how the situation developed and escalated, and subconsciously, your brain is filing all of that away as potentially useful information.
So it's almost like a training exercise for dangerous situations, even if it doesn't feel remotely like that when you're sitting on your sofa watching it.
Exactly. Your conscious mind thinks you're just watching an entertaining documentary, but your subconscious is quietly taking notes the whole time.
That's genuinely fascinating and a little unsettling at the same time, if I'm honest.
Welcome to psychology.
There's another theory I find really compelling, and it's more about pure curiosity. Humans are naturally drawn to things that are completely outside of their normal everyday experience. Violent crime is something most of us will, thankfully, never encounter in real life.
So it's a way of safely exploring something dangerous from a distance, kind of like watching a horror movie. You get the adrenaline and the tension without the actual risk.
Precisely. Some psychologists call this benign masochism. You're deliberately exposing yourself to something frightening or disturbing, but in a completely controlled environment where you know you're safe.
I love that term, benign masochism. And now that you say it, it also explains roller coasters, horror films, really spicy food.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly broad concept once you start applying it. But with true crime specifically, there's an extra element that I think is really key: the puzzle.
What do you mean by the puzzle exactly?
Well, most true crime content is structured around a central mystery. Who did it? How? Why? Were there warning signs? And our brains are genuinely wired to find that kind of puzzle incredibly satisfying to work through. There's actually a neurological reason for this. Solving a problem or figuring out an answer releases dopamine in the brain.
Dopamine, the so-called feel-good chemical. So we're literally getting a small chemical reward every time we piece together part of the story?
In a way, yes. And that reward loop keeps you coming back for more. It can become almost addictive by design, which is why you end up watching 4 episodes in one night.
I feel very called out right now.
As you should.
Okay, but I want to push back on something here, because there's a side to this that I think people don't talk about enough. What about the victims and their families? Sometimes I'm watching these documentaries and I catch myself thinking, is this actually ethical? Are we consuming someone's worst and most traumatic moment as pure entertainment?
That is such an important question, and honestly, it's a conversation the true crime community has been having a lot more openly lately. There's been real and very vocal criticism of certain shows and podcasts that exploit victim stories without giving proper respect or dignity to the people involved.
I remember there was a massive backlash against that Netflix documentary about Jeffrey Dahmer, wasn't there? Several of his victims' families spoke out publicly and said they felt completely re-traumatized by it, that nobody had asked for their permission or input.
Yes, exactly. And that raises a really difficult question about where the line is. When does true crime content go from being genuinely educational or awareness-raising to being purely exploitative?
I think the intention behind it and the execution both matter enormously. There's a huge difference between a documentary that centers the victims, gives them dignity and a voice, and raises genuine awareness, versus one that glamorizes the criminal and treats the whole thing as high-drama entertainment.
Completely agree. The best true crime content, in my opinion, is the kind that makes you think seriously about wider issues, failures in the justice system, how society treats vulnerable people, what warning signs were consistently missed, and why.
Yes, it should make you angry about systemic problems and structural failures, not just thrilled by the drama of it all.
So there's actually a really interesting ongoing debate about whether true crime as a genre has a net positive impact on society or whether it ultimately does more harm than good overall. What's your honest take?
I think it can genuinely do a lot of good when it's done responsibly and thoughtfully. There are real documented cases where podcasts and documentaries have directly helped to solve cold cases. A listener hears a detail, recognizes something, and comes forward with information that investigators didn't have.
Absolutely. There are some podcasts that are entirely focused on a single unsolved case and have generated thousands of new tips for investigators over the years. That kind of civic engagement is genuinely powerful.
And beyond that, there are also cases where people who were wrongly convicted have been exonerated because public attention was drawn to the inconsistencies in their case by true crime content. That's a pretty powerful argument in its favor, I think.
On the other hand, there are some legitimate concerns that I don't think we can just brush aside. Some researchers argue that true crime content actually distorts people's perception of how common violent crime really is in their daily lives. If you consume enough of it, you can start to feel like the world is far more dangerous than it statistically actually is.
That's called the mean world syndrome, isn't it? The theory that heavy and sustained media consumption of violent content makes people genuinely believe that the world around them is more threatening than reality suggests.
Exactly. It was originally described by a media researcher called George Gerbner back in the 1970s, but it's become incredibly relevant again today, given the sheer volume of crime-related content that's available to us at any moment.
And I think there's also a real risk of oversimplifying genuinely complex social issues. True crime can sometimes reduce deep systemic problems, poverty, mental illness, social inequality, down to very simple individual stories of good versus evil.
Right, and that's a much easier story to tell and to sell. It's far simpler to frame something as one bad person making terrible choices than to honestly explore why the mental health system failed someone repeatedly or how years of economic desperation can push a person towards crime.
So I think as a consumer, the key is to stay genuinely critical and reflective. Enjoy it, learn from it, let it spark your curiosity about bigger issues, but don't ever let it be your only lens for understanding crime and justice.
Well put. Be an active, questioning viewer rather than a passive one.
There's actually something else I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is this whole phenomenon of amateur online sleuthing. You know, where thousands of people on Reddit or TikTok basically appoint themselves detectives and try to solve cases themselves.
Oh yeah, the armchair detective thing. It's massive. There are entire online communities dedicated to it.
Right, and on one level, I get the appeal completely. You feel like you're doing something useful, contributing to justice. You're not just a passive viewer, you're actively participating.
But
there have been some really serious cases where online communities got it completely wrong and accused innocent people, publicly, with real consequences for those people's lives.
that's absolutely true. The Boston Marathon bombing case in 2013 is probably the most well-known example. Reddit users collectively identified the suspect, and it turned out to be an innocent missing student whose family was then harassed during one of the worst moments of their lives.
That's devastating, and it highlights something really important about the difference between consuming true crime and actually inserting yourself into an active investigation.
There's a term for the misidentification of a suspect. It's called a wrongful accusation, and the psychological process behind it is fascinating and quite troubling. When a crowd of people are all convinced they found the answer, something called confirmation bias kicks in.
Confirmation bias. That's when you only notice and remember the evidence that supports what you already believe, and you unconsciously dismiss anything that contradicts it.
Exactly. So once a crowd online decides someone looks guilty, they start collecting only the evidence that confirms that belief. They stop seeing the person as a full human being and start seeing them as a puzzle piece that fits their theory.
And that's incredibly dangerous, because unlike professional investigators, these communities have no oversight, no accountability, and no legal obligation to be accurate.
Which is why most law enforcement agencies have actually spoken out against this kind of amateur involvement, even when it's well-intentioned. Real detective work requires access to evidence that the public simply doesn't have, and drawing the wrong conclusions publicly can actually damage an official investigation.
So I think the message is, it's fine to be interested, to theorize privately, to engage with the content intellectually. But the moment you start publicly naming and targeting real people based on a Reddit thread, you've crossed a line.
Completely. And actually, I think that's a really good example of why critical thinking and media literacy matters so much. It's not just about understanding what you're watching. It's about understanding the real-world consequences of how you engage with it.
Media literacy really is one of the most important skills of our time, isn't it? Especially now, when anyone with a phone can become a publisher and broadcast accusations to millions of people instantly.
Absolutely. It's something schools should be teaching properly, honestly.
Okay, so to wrap up, do you think you'll keep watching true crime yourself, Jake, now that we've basically psychoanalyzed the whole habit?
Absolutely, without a doubt. If anything, I find it even more interesting now that I understand a bit better why I'm watching it. I'm just going to be more selective and more conscious about what I choose.
Same here. I think I'll be sticking to content that actually has something meaningful or challenging to say, rather than just pure shock value and drama.
And honestly, that's probably a bit rule for media consumption in general, not just true crime.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so our question for you today, listeners, is this. Do you watch or listen to true crime content? And if so, what do you think draws you to it personally? Is it the puzzle aspect, the psychology, the sense of justice being served, or something else entirely?
Drop your answer in the comments below, in English, of course. It's great practice for your writing, and we genuinely love hearing your perspectives.
We really do read every single comment. And if you're feeling up for a challenge, try using some of the vocabulary from today's glossary in your answer.
We'll be watching. No pun intended.
Very smooth, Jake.
Thanks so much for listening today. Genuinely glad you joined us.
As usual, you'll find a full glossary in the description for any terminology that might trip you up. No excuses not to follow along.
Right. See you in the next one.
Bye.